Let me tell you something powerful. You didn't walk into that relationship, that workplace, that friendship by accident. You were assigned not to entertain the narcissist, but to confront the spirit operating through them. And here are 5 signs that you are God's final warning before he shuts the whole thing down. They had a script. They had a rhythm. They had a well-rehearsed cycle of chaos and control, charm and confusion, blame and justification, and it worked until you walked in. Because when you showed up, something shifted. You didn't just enter their life, you interrupted it. You threw off their timing. You disrupted their grip, but you didn't play by their rules. You started asking questions they never had to answer before. You noticed inconsistencies they thought no one would see. You didn't respond with fear when they tried intimidation. You didn't give in to guilt when they tried to twist the narrative. They were used to applause and obedience, not resistance, and certainly not discernment. You didn't just interrupt their words, you disrupted their strategy, and they didn't know what to do with you. When God sends someone to interrupt a pattern, it's never random. He sends someone bold enough to confront without becoming bitter. Someone loving enough to care, but strong enough to not be controlled. Someone who will speak peace into the storm without being swallowed by it. That someone was you. You walked in with peace, and their chaos couldn't handle it. You walked in with clarity, and their confusion couldn't twist it. You didn't match their energy. You brought heaven's authority. That's what made you a threat. Not because you were loud, but because you were grounded. They tried the silent treatment, it didn't work. They tried the charm offensive, it didn't work. They tried spinning stories to make you doubt yourself, it didn't work. Because you weren't moving based on what they said, you were rooted in what God had revealed. And when someone is rooted like that, manipulation loses its grip. Control stops working. The fog starts to lift. And suddenly, what had been cycling for years starts falling apart. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you stood. It was your refusal to shrink just to keep the peace. It was your decision to stop excusing dysfunction in the name of grace. It was you setting boundaries without explanation. You simply refused to pretend anymore. You stopped playing along. You interrupted the performance. And when you did, you exposed just how dependent they were on being the whole system they built depended on silence, secrecy, and self-doubt. But God placed someone in their life who wouldn't stay silent, who wouldn't stay confused, who wouldn't be manipulated. You weren't sent to entertain their patterns. You were sent to interrupt them. You became the evidence that healing was possible, that freedom was available, that the cycle could be broken. You stood tall where others bowed down. You stayed grounded where others walked away in shame. You walked in discernment when others were still drowning in deception. They thought you'd be another victim of their cycle, but God made you the interruption. And once a cycle is interrupted, it can never go back to operating like before. Because now they know God sent someone who wouldn't play along. You don't just carry a kind heart, you carry a righteous fire. And that's what they didn't see coming. Narcissists are used to exploiting empathy, weaponizing kindness, and turning compassion into compliance. They know how to cry in the right places, how to say the right things, how to play the victim while making you feel like the villain. They prey on the ones who care, because compassion often comes without confrontation, but not with you. Because your compassion came with conviction. Your love came with limits. Your grace came with truth. And that shook them. You showed up in their life not just to offer comfort, but to bring clarity. And clarity feels like judgment to someone who has lived in delusion. You didn't attack them. You didn't expose them with gossip or revenge. You just stood your ground. You spoke with honesty. You walked with integrity. And when someone walks in truth, those living in lies feel it like a threat. Not because you were aggressive, but because you were anchored. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were hoping they'd heal. But healing requires humility, and humility was something they weren't willing to embrace. So your conviction became offensive. Your standards became too much. Your boundaries became an insult. Because in their mind, love should mean surrender. Love should mean silence. Love should mean never calling out the behavior that keeps them in control. But your kind of love doesn't look like codependence. It looks like accountability. And accountability terrifies someone who's built their identity on illusions. They were used to people who let things slide, who kept the peace at all costs, who loved with fear instead of wisdom. But you were different. Your compassion had eyes wide open. You saw the manipulation, and you still chose to show mercy. You noticed the gaslighting, and you still chose to speak blessing. But you also didn't back down. You didn't twist yourself into a version they could control. You didn't water down the truth just to keep their ego comfortable. You didn't abandon your discernment for the sake of their dysfunction. You carried both the warmth of love and the weight of truth. And that combination was convicting. Not because you shamed them, but because your life revealed what they refused to deal with. You didn't scream. You didn't fight dirty. You just refused to be fooled. And that exposed them. The way you held your peace when they tried to provoke you. The way you kept your integrity when they tried to discredit you. The way you stayed in your calling when they tried to keep you in confusion. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Because true conviction doesn't need a platform. It doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to prove a point. It just stands. They tried to get you to fold. They tried to twist your love into guilt. But your heart wasn't just soft. It was steady. That's what set you apart. You didn't show up to destroy them. You showed up to draw a line. You didn't come to condemn. You came to clarify. You came with a love that refuses to lie. A love that says, I see your pain, but I won't participate in your poison. A love that says, I still believe you can be free, but I won't be the one you drag down while you resist healing. That's the kind of love Jesus carried. That's the kind of love that flips tables in temples. That's the kind of love that confronts without condemning. And that's the kind of love you carry. Not just compassion, but they were sure it would work. It always had before. The stories, the guilt trips, the silent treatment, the blame shifting. It was all part of a pattern they had perfected. They knew how to twist reality, how to make you question yourself, how to make the wrong feel like it was somehow your fault. They knew how to change the subject just in time, cry on cue, or act like nothing ever happened. They thought they had you figured out. But this time they were wrong, because this time they met someone who didn't fall for the script. This time they encountered someone who knew who they were, who knew the difference between guilt and responsibility, between forgiveness and access. They were sure it would work. It always had before. The stories, the guilt trips, the silent treatment, the blame shifting, it was all part of a pattern they had perfected. They knew how to twist reality, how to make you question yourself, how to make the wrong feel like it was somehow your fault. They knew how to change the subject just in time, cry on cue, or act like nothing ever happened. They thought they had you figured out, but this time they were wrong, because this time they met someone who didn't fall for the script. This time they encountered someone who knew who they were, who knew the difference between guilt and responsibility, between forgiveness and access, between peacekeeping and truth-telling. You didn't flinch, not because you didn't feel anything, but because you finally realized you didn't have to carry what wasn't yours. You started to see through the words that sounded nice, but were filled with control. You started recognizing the pattern that always ended with you apologizing for something they did. You caught on to how they would bait you with kindness and then punish you with silence. And then punish you with silence. You stopped being moved by the extremes, the sudden love bombing, the rage, the withdrawal. It didn't work on you anymore, because God had trained your spirit to stay steady. They didn't expect that. They were used to controlling the emotional thermostat. If they wanted attention, they created chaos. If they wanted sympathy, they played the victim. If they wanted distance, they blamed you for being too much or not enough. But when you didn't react like everyone else had, something broke in the system, because manipulation loses power in the presence of discernment. And discernment doesn't come from just reading people. It comes from walking with God. You started asking different questions. Not what did I do wrong, but what spirit is operating here? Not how can I fix this, but why am I tolerating this? You didn't stop loving them. You just stopped losing yourself. You didn't stop praying for them. You just stopped pretending their behavior was okay. And when you did that, when you stayed rooted in truth instead of tossed around by their moods, they felt it. They tried harder. They got louder. They got more dramatic. But you remained calm. And that calm wasn't weakness. That calm was warfare. It was you saying, I will not be dragged into this storm. It was you choosing peace over panic, wisdom over reaction, truth over the need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. They kept reaching into their old bag of tricks, tears, accusations, gaslighting, deflection, but your eyes were open. You didn't even need to argue. You didn't need to prove your side. You just stood still, and your stillness spoke louder than any sermon. It said, I see you, I forgive you, but I won't play this game anymore. And that unsettled them. Because for the first time, they realized the control they had counted on was gone. Not because you became hard, but because you became whole. You weren't manipulated into silence anymore. You weren't baited into reacting anymore. You weren't controlled by fear, shame, or guilt. You had grown past it. You had been refined by the fire and could finally recognize what was real. That's what it means to withstand their manipulation. It means you hold your peace when everything in you wants to prove a point. It means you don't answer every accusation. It means you stay steady when they try to stir confusion. And in that stillness, in that holy resistance, in that refusal to bow down to their dysfunction, you become unshakable, not cold, not bitter, but free. And that's the power they never expected you to have. There was a time when their words shaped you. A time when their approval felt like oxygen and their silence felt like suffocation. You bent, you shrank, you questioned yourself. Because they made you believe your worth was up for debate. One minute you were everything, the next minute you were too much, not enough, or somehow both at the same time. They praised you when it suited them and withdrew when it didn't. And they came with a word, and they suffered your soul because they made you believe your worth was up for debate. One minute you were everything, the next it felt like you were nothing. You didn't stop caring altogether. You just stopped letting their opinion define you. You stopped giving weight to voices that only spoke life when it served them. You stopped handing out pieces of your peace to people who only held it hostage. You didn't get colder. You got clearer. Clarity taught you that needing constant reassurance from someone who benefits from your insecurity is not love. It's bondage. And God didn't create you to live in emotional captivity. He created you to be free, to be bold, to be rooted in something deeper than applause and deeper than attention. He created you to stand on truth, not tiptoe around egos. You started going to God for your identity instead of going to them for approval. And when that happened, their games lost power. The compliments didn't move you like they used to, and the criticism didn't crush you like it used to. Because you knew who you were before they tried to rewrite your story. You stopped apologizing for being confident. You stopped minimizing your gifts to make them feel comfortable. You stopped trying to be chosen by someone who only picked you when you were easy to control. Their validation used to be a drug. Now, you're sober. Now, you're stable. They noticed it too. They could feel the shift in you. The version of you that jumped through hoops, over-explained everything, walked on eggshells and begged for clarity, that version was gone. You stopped explaining your no. You stopped defending your peace. You stopped shrinking every time they didn't clap. And that unsettled them, because validation was the leash they used to keep you close. Now you've cut it. Now you walk free, even if they don't understand it, even if they mock it, even if they pretend it doesn't bother them. Because it does. It bothers the spirit of manipulation when you no longer rely on external approval. It bothers insecurity when it can't shape your identity anymore. You started seeing how much of their attention was just manipulation dressed up as concern. How much of their praise was meant to buy control. How often their silence was used as punishment. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. That's when God began to fortify you from the inside out. He whispered in the places they wounded. He confirmed in the quiet what they confused with their chaos. He reminded you that you are loved, not for what you do, not for how you perform, not for how well you manage their emotions, but for who you are, for who He created you to be. And that kind of validation doesn't fade when people withdraw. It doesn't crumble when you're misunderstood. It doesn't get lost when people withhold love. You didn't mean to be a mirror. You weren't trying to expose anything. You were just being yourself, real, honest, vulnerable, sincere. But that kind of authenticity is dangerous to someone hiding behind a mask. Because when you live in truth, you reflect what others are trying to avoid. You became a living contradiction to their deception. You didn't call them out with your words, your presence, the way you loved, the way you forgave, the way you owned your flaws and kept growing. That kind of transparency was confronting, not because you were perfect, but because you were real. And they've spent their whole life running from real. You didn't even know how much your light was exposing their shadows until they started reacting. They began to withdraw, to attack, to gaslight, to criticize. They needed you to doubt yourself because your confidence threatened their control. They needed you to second guess your intentions because your integrity unsettled their image. They needed to reframe everything good about you into something questionable, so they didn't have to deal with the truth that maybe the problem wasn't you. The problem, maybe it was what you were revealing in them. Because when you refuse to play their game, when you won't bend to manipulation or shrink for the sake of comfort, it shows how deeply they are still imprisoned by their own lies. You didn't match their energy, and that drove them crazy. You stayed kind when they turned cold. You stayed honest when they spun narratives. You stayed steady when they tried to provoke chaos. And your steadiness began to expose their instability. You weren't loud. You weren't aggressive. You just didn't flinch. And when someone's whole identity is built on image and illusion, being around someone who is deeply rooted and fully seen feels threatening, because it starts to highlight the emptiness inside, the brokenness they refuse to acknowledge, the wounds they refuse to heal, the truth They refuse to accept. You mirrored what they've spent years avoiding. And it wasn't the words you said, it was the truth you carried. It was how you refused to settle. It was how you kept showing up with love, not just emotion, but action. It was how you confronted behavior without becoming bitter. How you called things what they were, not to shame, but to shed light. And light always disturbs what hides in the dark. That's why they needed to discredit you. That's why they twisted your words and questioned your motives, because admitting that you were right meant admitting they were wrong, and they'd rather lose a real relationship than face a real reflection. But you didn't mirror their manipulation, you mirrored their missed potential. You reminded them of the version of themselves they buried. The soft heart, the clear conscience, the desire to be known without having to control everything. They saw that in you and it scared them. Because to accept that light, they'd have to let go of their ego. They'd have to admit the damage they caused. They'd have to face the shame, the insecurity, the trauma they've used as an excuse for too long. You were a picture of what healing looks like, not perfection, healing. And healing demands humility. That's what they couldn't handle. You didn't just wander into their life. You were placed, assigned, positioned by God. Not because you were weak, but because you were strong enough to stand in the storm without bowing to it. You were sent, not swayed. And that's why it never made sense to them. That's why they couldn't figure you out. You didn't react the way they expected. You didn't break the way they intended. You didn't stay the way they tried to mold. You didn't dance to the rhythm of their dysfunction. You had your own beat, your own purpose, your own conviction. And deep down they knew you weren't like the others, because you weren't chasing approval. You were walking in assignment. They pushed and you stayed grounded. They pulled and you kept your center. They changed the script, but you didn't lose your voice. Every attempt to shift your identity failed because it was already rooted in something they couldn't touch. They were used to people bending to fit the role they created, people who adjusted to survive, but you didn't survive their chaos. You disrupted it. Not because you were trying to, but because the spirit inside you wouldn't let you blend in with what God called you to challenge. You were sent with discernment, and that discernment frustrated their manipulation. You were sent with truth, and that truth irritated their performance. You were sent with boundaries, and those boundaries exposed their lack of respect. You were sent with love, not the kind that enables, but the kind that confronts with grace and stands with courage. And when someone is used to controlling the environment, someone who brings holy disruption feels danger. But you weren't trying to be dangerous. You were just being obedient. They saw your softness and mistook it for weakness, but that softness was strength under control. You were compassionate, but not gullible. You were empathetic, but not blind. You could feel deeply and still think clearly. That combination made you unmovable. It made you confusing to someone who relied on emotional manipulation to keep their world intact. You weren't swayed by compliments, nor were you crushed by criticism. That kind of balance is rare, and it's threatening to someone who needs power to feel secure. You didn't need power. You already had authority. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't force, doesn't fear. The kind that comes from being sent. Being sent means you didn't show up to please. You didn't show up to fix. You didn't show up to carry what was never yours. You showed up to represent something higher, something holy, something that cannot be bought, twisted, or manipulated. That's why the attacks didn't work. That's why the lies didn't stick. That's why the smear campaigns lost momentum. You didn't panic because you weren't here to be liked. You knew who called you, and that clarity gave you courage. Even when it hurt, even when it was lonely, even when it would have been easier to just give in. They tried to rewrite the narrative, tried to make you the villain. But people sent by God don't need to defend themselves. Truth will always rise. And when you're sent, you don't need a crowd. You need conviction. You don't need applause. You need alignment. You don't need their permission because you already have God's commissioning. You knew deep down that staying true to your calling would cost you something. But you also knew it would cost you even more to betray your own spirit just to keep someone comfortable in their dysfunction. That's why you couldn't stay silent when others did. That's why you couldn't look away when the red flags were waving. That's why you couldn't be manipulated into peace when there was a war being waged on your soul. You weren't just another person in their story. You were the turning point. Not because of what you said, but because of who you were. You were sent. And when you're sent, you don't stay where you're not on. You don't fight to belong where God has only called you to stand. You walk in, you speak truth, you shake things up, and when the assignment is done, you walk away free because you were never swayed, only sent.
Hey, thanks for stopping by my YouTube channel. I hope you were blessed today. If you were, share this with somebody. Like and subscribe and leave me a comment. Let me know where you're watching from, what we can pray for you about. Hope to see you back here again really soon.